Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
So, I want you to just imagine for a second that you're standing in the middle of a really busy modern city.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Lots of traffic, people rushing everywhere.
Right, exactly. And everyone around you is just frantically trying to optimize their lives. Like, you see people checking their phones for that immediate validation, right?
Oh, yeah, getting those dopamine hits from likes and comments.
Yeah, or they're aggressively debating complete strangers online, just trying to prove their moral superiority.
And spending, literally billions of dollars trying to mask the fact that they're aging.
Exactly. We live in this culture that is just completely obsessed with outward performance and immediate feedback. Everything has to be visible and fast.
But the crazy thing is, and this is what we're getting into today, if you strip away the smartphones and the skyscrapers, you're actually describing the exact psychological landscape of ancient India.
It is wild how identical it is.
It really is. So for today's deep dive, we are stepping into that ancient world. We're unpacking a really radical philosophical text from the Dhammapada.
Specifically, we're looking at the chapters on evil, punishment, old age, and self. Right.
Right. Chapters 9 through 12. And in its original context, this was a society that was rigidly obsessed with external markers of worth.
Oh, absolutely. Like you had the caste system, which basically dictated your purity the second you were born.
Yeah, based entirely on who your parents were.
And then you had these ascetics, people basically torturing themselves, wandering around naked, starving themselves.
Flying on the bare earth.
Yeah, performing these massive public displays of suffering just to prove to everyone else, like, look how spiritually pure I am.
Just ancient virtue signaling, basically.
Yeah, it is exactly what it was. And the author of this text looks at that entire circus of outward performance and just, completely dismisses it.
He's just like, nope, you're all missing the point entirely.
Right. He stages this total rebellion. He moves the battleground away from the external world and puts it directly inside the human mind.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. Because this isn't just a history lesson, this is a masterclass in extreme personal accountability designed directly for you, the listener.
Yeah, the core thesis here is just radical, absolute self-responsibility.
Meaning no one else can fix you.
Exactly. It proposes this universe where no external force, no religious ritual, no guru, and no other person can save you or purify you.
It just violently strips away every single excuse we use, like how we blame our unhappiness on our circumstances or our biology or our boss.
It's all on you. But before we can talk about how to actually fix the self, we kind of have to understand the underlying physics of this universe.
Right, the mechanics of how action actually works, or what the ancient world called karma.
Yeah, and I think we need to be careful here because modern people hear karma and they think of like instant cosmic payback.
Like someone cuts you off in traffic and then gets a flat tire 2 miles down the road.
Right. But the text introduces this concept not as magic, but almost like an agricultural process. It's heavily delayed.
A delayed process. Tell me more about that.
Well, it says that an evildoer will actually see happiness, but only as long as their evil deed has not, quote, ripened.
Ripened. That's such an interesting word choice.
It is, because when it ripens, that's when they see the evil. And it applies the exact same logic to a good person. They might see dark days until their good deed finally ripens.
Okay, so that operative word, ripened, that forces a complete recalibration of how we view time.
Oh, it really does. Because, we are biologically and culturally wired to expect immediate feedback, right?
Right, like evolutionary psychology. If there's a rustle in the bushes, you need to know right now if it's a tiger.
Exactly. Our ancestors needed to respond to acute threats immediately. If you make a choice, you expect an immediate result.
And today, that instinct is just hyper-accelerated. You order a package, it's on your porch the next morning.
You post a controversial opinion, and you get that hit of dopamine from the likes in 30 seconds.
But this text is arguing that moral and psychological physics operate on a completely different timeline. And I think that delay is what creates so much of our modern cynicism.
What do you mean?
Well, we look around and we see some corrupt corporate executive making millions of dollars
Okay.
or just a deeply selfish person enjoying this lavish vacation, and we immediately conclude that the system is broken. We think morality is just a joke because the bad guy is clearly winning.
Right, we get super cynical.
But this philosophy is saying, wait, you're just taking a snapshot of a seed that hasn't broken through the soil yet.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that executive is experiencing happiness only because the consequences of their actions are still incubating.
The physics are in motion, you just can't see them yet.
Exactly. It's this profound demand for patience. You just can't judge the trajectory of human life or the ultimate consequence of a habit by a single moment in time.
And the text gives us this brilliant visual for this invisible accumulation, doesn't it? The water pot.
Yes, the water pot analogy. It warns the reader not to think lightly of small bad habits.
Yeah.
It says, people say, it will not come nigh unto me.
Like, oh, it won't affect me.
Right, but it says, even by the falling of water drops, a water pot is filled. The fool becomes full of evil, little by little.
Little by little. I mean, think about the actual mechanics of a single drop of water. If you stare at an empty clay pot and one drop falls in, your brain barely registers it.
Right. Statistically, it's totally insignificant. The pot is functionally empty.
But this is exactly where our own cognitive dissonance protects us from seeing our own slow degradation.
How so?
Well, when we tell a tiny white lie just to avoid taking responsibility for something, or we do something mildly selfish at work, it doesn't trigger our internal alarm system.
Right, the tiger didn't jump out of the bushes. We survived the interaction.
Exactly. So we tell ourselves, it will not come nigh unto me. We convince ourselves we are the exception to the rule.
We really do. And, this sounds...
Actually, it sounds exactly like the concept of compound interest in finance, right? Just applied to morality and character.
Oh, that's a perfect modern translation. Explain that a bit more.
Well, if you put a tiny amount of money into an index fund every day, you don't feel wealthy on day 2, right? Or day 20.
No, you're still basically broke.
But 20 years later, the math compounds into an absolute fortune.
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, if you carry a small daily deficit, like a little bit of credit card debt, the interest quietly eats you alive.
Until one day you wake up and you are entirely bankrupt.
Right. We don't notice a daily 1% degradation in our character, but the text is absolute. The pot fills.
It fills. And here is the really terrifying part. Once it fills, there is no geographical escape.
Nowhere to hide.
Nowhere. The author writes, not in the sky, not in the midst of the sea, not if we enter into the clefts of the mountains, is there known a spot in the whole world where a man might be freed from an evil deed.
Which directly attacked the modern concept of the geographic cure.
Oh, the geographic cure, yes.
Like, how often do we see people who are just deeply unhappy? Their relationships are in completely shambles. They're miserable at work.
And their solution is always to move to a new city.
Right. I just need a fresh start. They change jobs, or they go backpack across Europe for 6 months. They literally think the problem is their zip code.
But they take their own nervous system with them on the plane.
Exactly. You pack your baggage.
You take your own subconscious biases, your own emotional reactivity, and your unhealed resentments into the sky and under the sea.
The psychological weight of your actions is the only thing you actually own. You cannot outrun your own mind.
So true. But I think this naturally raises a question, right? Because if we can't run, how are we supposed to navigate a world that actually is chaotic and sometimes really malicious?
Right, because bad things do happen to us from the outside.
Exactly. And the text introduces this amazing analogy to explain this, the wound on the hand.
The wound on the hand. Break that down for us.
So it says that a person who has no wound on their hand can safely touch poison, because poison cannot enter a system without a wound to receive it.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is arguably one of the most sophisticated psychological insights in ancient literature.
It really is. Let's look at the mechanics of it. The poison represents the external toxicity of the world, right?
Right. The insults, the unfairness, the anger of some random stranger in traffic.
Or the passive aggression of a colleague at work.
Sure. And usually our instinct when faced with that poison is to build armor. We think, okay, I need to toughen up, I need to build walls, I need to fight this poison off.
We get super defensive. But the text suggests something totally counterintuitive. It says the external poison cannot infect your bloodstream unless you provide it an entry point.
The wound.
The wound. And psychologically speaking, that wound is your own internal insecurity, your own fragile ego, or your own unhealed malice.
Okay, let's ground that in a super modern example so we can really see how it works.
Yeah, give me an example.
Let's say someone insults my intelligence on the internet. Someone calls me stupid in a comment section.
Happens every day.
Right. Now, if I am deeply insecure about my intellect, if I have a massive open psychological wound right there, that insult enters my system immediately.
The poison gets in.
Instantly. I feel a huge spike in cortisol, my heart rate elevates, I get furious, and my entire day is just ruined.
But what if you don't have the wound?
Well, if I am completely secure in who I am, if I've done the internal work and I don't have that specific insecurity, that exact same insult is literally just pixels on a screen.
Right, it's just meaningless data.
Exactly. I can touch it, I can observe it, and it does absolutely nothing to my internal state because there's no wound for the poison to enter.
The implication of that is just staggering, though. It means that when we are deeply offended or hurt by the chaotic actions of other people, it's actually a diagnostic tool.
Pointing us toward our own unhealed stuff.
Exactly. It points us directly to our own wounds. If there is no internal resonance with malice, the external malice just bounces off.
Which naturally leads us to ask, and this is a great reflection for you listening right now, how do we start closing those wounds? How do we stop generating our own poison?
Right. And to answer that, the text pivots to how we interact with others. It establishes what we might call the ultimate empathy principle.
The empathy principle, what does the author say?
It states, quote, "All men tremble at punishment. All men fear death. Remember that you are like unto them, and do not kill nor cause slaughter."
Wow. That requires us to basically strip away every single social label we use to categorize each other.
And we use a lot of labels.
Constantly. When you're looking at a political rival or a really frustrating neighbor or someone who has deeply wronged you, your brain desperately wants to categorize them as this abstract enemy.
An other, someone less human.
Right. But this text forces you to look at their actual biology. Beneath whatever tough or abrasive or annoying exterior they present, they are a biological creature.
With a central nervous system.
Yes. A nervous system that trembles at pain exactly like yours does. Recognizing that shared fundamental vulnerability, that is the absolute root of true nonviolence.
Because if you seek your own happiness by crushing others who are also just trying to seek happiness, you are violating the fundamental physics of the universe we just established.
The karma physics.
Right. You're planting a seed of cruelty and somehow expecting to harvest joy. It just doesn't work. The math doesn't add up.
And the text specifically highlights the boomerang effect of how we speak to each other, doesn't it?
It does. It warns. Do not speak harshly to anybody. Those who are spoken to will answer thee in the same way. Angry speech is painful. Blows for blows will touch thee.
Blows for blows. I mean, we see this mechanic playing out millions of times a second in the architecture of social media today.
Oh, it's literally the business model.
Exactly. The platforms are algorithmically designed to encourage harsh speech because it drives engagement.
Someone posts an enraging comment and you feel this actual physiological urge to strike back.
So you deliver a digital blow, and then they escalate, and suddenly you're in an infinite energy loop of contention.
An infinite loop. But the text actually offers a really specific remedy to break this loop. The analogy of the shattered gong.
Oh, I love this one. Tell us about the gong.
It says, "If, like a shattered metal plate or a gong, thou utter not, then thou hast reached nirvana. Contention is not known to thee."
Okay, we definitely need to define nirvana here, because I think modern listeners hear that word and they immediately mistake it for some mystical heaven in the clouds.
Right, like playing harps on a cloud. But in a secular psychological context, nirvana simply translates to blowing out or extinguishing.
Like blowing out a candle.
Exactly. It is the extinguishing of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. It is a state of profound, absolute non-reactivity.
So how does the gong fit into this non-reactivity?
Well, think about a healthy, newly cast bronze gong. It's literally designed to reverberate. If you strike it, the metal vibrates and sends this massive sound wave across the room.
Right, it passes the energy along.
But if you take a hammer and you shatter that metal plate into pieces, and then you try to strike it again, what happens?
You just get a dull thud. The energy stops dead.
Exactly. The author is challenging us to be the shattered plate when it comes to anger.
So when someone strikes you with a harsh word, your instinct is to vibrate with indignation, to pass the blow along.
Right, but you yell at your partner because your boss yelled at you.
But if you can absorb the strike and simply not ring out, you break the chain of suffering. You ground the electrical current.
That is what it means to not know contention.
But I've got to pause here because the text makes some really intense claims about what happens to people who don't absorb the blow, especially people who inflict pain on the innocent.
Yeah, it lists 10 pretty terrifying consequences.
Right. It says the cruel person will suffer heavy affliction, loss of mind, misfortune from the king, fearful accusations, destruction of relationships, and that lightning fire will literally burn their houses down.
It's a heavy list.
It is, and honestly, I have to push back hard on this because to a modern ear, this sounds exactly like superstitious victim blaming.
I completely see why you'd say that.
Like if a massive wildfire burns down a family's home in California or someone is falsely accused of a horrific crime, are we seriously supposed to believe the universe is magically punishing them because they were mean 10 years ago?
That is such a critical pushback. And it really highlights why we have to use discernment here. We have to separate enduring psychological wisdom from ancient cultural assumptions.
So how do we separate them?
Well, if we read that list as literal divine retribution from the sky, it is absolutely magical thinking. And it is victim blaming.
Right, which isn't helpful to anyone.
But let's take a step back and look at the actual psychological mechanisms of a life built on cruelty. Let's look at how a life unravels.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that unraveling. How does everyday cruelty lead to something like loss of mind?
Think about the physiological toll of chronic deception and malice. If you are constantly exploiting others, your nervous system is trapped in a perpetual state of hypervigilance.
Because you always have to remember your lies.
Exactly. You constantly have to watch your back. That chronic stress physically degrades the brain over time. It ruins your mental health. That is your heavy affliction or your loss of mind.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about loss of relations?
Well, if you treat people as expendable tools for your own success, you systematically burn every bridge you have. When a crisis inevitably hits your life, you have zero support system.
You're completely isolated.
Right. And what about misfortune from the king or fearful accusations?
Yeah, what does the king have to do with it?
In the ancient world, the king represented the legal system and the social order. So if you operate unethically, if you cut corners and step on people, you dramatically increase the probability of legal ruin.
Oh, like getting sued or audited?
Yes, or social ostracization. You attract accusations because your baseline behavior is inherently suspicious.
Okay, so it isn't that a magical thunderbolt targets your house. It's that a life built on exploitation is structurally unstable.
The foundation is rotten, so eventually the roof is going to collapse under its own weight.
It's just the natural consequence of the water pot filling up over time.
Exactly. And the text contrasts this chaotic, inevitable collapse with this really beautiful image of intentional self-creation.
Let's hear it.
It says, well makers lead the water. Fletchers bend the arrow. Carpenters bend a log of wood. Good people fashion themselves.
Wow. Good people fashion themselves. Those verbs leading, bending, fashioning, they require intense, sustained force.
You don't accidentally become a person of deep integrity.
Yeah.
Any more than a raw log of wood accidentally turns into a finely crafted dining chair.
Right. You have to take the raw, chaotic material of your own mind, your biological impulses, your biases, your anger, and actively carve it.
It is the ultimate DIY project.
And importantly, the text points out that this carving, this inner work, has absolutely nothing to do with what you are wearing on the outside.
Right. It mounts this blistering critique of the aesthetics we talked about earlier.
It says that nakedness, fasting, plaited hair, or lying on the dirt cannot purify a mortal who has not actually overcome their internal desires.
You can sleep on a bed of nails for a year, but if your mind is full of resentment, you're just an angry, really uncomfortable person.
Right. And conversely, it says a person dressed in fine apparel, living a normal life, can be truly serene if their mind is restrained.
It completely separates the aesthetic of spirituality from the actual mechanics of psychological growth.
Which brings us to a transition in the text that is, well, it's incredibly uncomfortable, but it's absolutely necessary.
Here we go.
If we accept that external performances of purity are an illusion, the text demands we look at the ultimate external performance, our physical bodies.
Yeah, it asks this jarring, almost aggressive question. How is their laughter? How is their joy? This world is always burning.
And the author does not pull any punches here. He describes the human body in just brutal terms.
Very brutal.
He calls it a, quote, dressed up lump, covered with wounds, joined together, sickly, full of many thoughts, which has no strength, no hold. He even compares white bones to gourds thrown away in the autumn.
Autumn gourds. Just rotting in a field.
I mean, we really have to acknowledge how aggressively this clashes with modern sensibilities.
It's a direct assault on how we live today.
We live in an era entirely defined by the anti-aging industry. We have billion-dollar cosmetic companies, extreme dietary biohacking.
Real-time video filters on our phones designed to erase any evidence that time is passing.
Right. To a culture that worships youth and bodily perfection, calling the body a dressed-up lump or a heap of corruption sounds unhealthily morbid. It sounds like straight-up self-loathing.
It grates against our sensibilities because it directly attacks our primary coping mechanism.
Our coping mechanism for what?
For impermanence. We spend our entire lives polishing the walls of the physical fortress trying to convince ourselves it won't fall down.
We're terrified of aging.
Terrified. But let's look at the underlying intention here. This is not about hating the physical form.
No, what is it about?
It is a radical psychological intervention designed to cure the profound anxiety generated by our vanity.
Okay, unpack that. How does calling my body an autumn gourd cure my anxiety?
Think about the sheer volume of suffering generated by our attachment to staying young or looking a certain way or preserving physical strength. It is a completely unwinnable war.
Because gravity always wins.
Gravity, cellular degradation, and time have a 100% win rate. Nobody beats them.
Right.
So if you build your entire core identity on being the most beautiful or the strongest or the most physically vital person in the room, you are investing all of your psychological capital into a rapidly depreciating asset.
You are literally building your house on a crumbling cliff.
Precisely. By forcing you to look at the reality of bone, flesh, and decay, the autumn gourds, the text is trying to shock you out of a delusion.
It's a wake-up call.
It is. It says, the brilliant chariots of kings are destroyed, the body also approaches destruction, but the virtue of good people never approaches destruction.
It's attempting to redirect your investment portfolio, moving it from the physical, which is doomed, to the internal character, which endures.
And if you fail to make that transition, well, the text warns of a truly tragic outcome.
Yeah, it has this devastating poetic imagery for people who have not gained treasure in their youth. It says they perish like old herons in a lake without fish, or they lie like broken bows sighing after the pass.
That broken bow image is just so haunting.
It really is.
Because think about it, a bow exists for one reason, to create tension and launch an arrow. When it is broken, it loses its entire function. It can only sit there as a monument to what it used to do.
I read that and immediately thought, this is the most accurate, ancient description of a modern midlife crisis I've ever seen.
Oh, absolutely. Walk me through that parallel.
Just imagine someone who spends their youth entirely focused on superficial accumulation. They're chasing parties, shallow validation, maybe ruthlessly climbing a corporate ladder without developing any internal emotional discipline.
Or any meaningful, deep relationships.
Exactly. Then they hit 50 or 60, the physical vitality drops, the looks fade, the status shifts to someone younger. And because they haven't cultivated any internal resources, they find themselves standing in an empty lake.
The lake without fish.
They have zero fish to feed themselves psychologically, so what do? All they can do is sit around at a bar and endlessly recount the glory days, sighing after the past because their present is completely hollow.
It is the tragedy of an unexamined life reaching its natural conclusion. I mean, if your only source of joy was external validation, what happens when the world simply stops looking at you?
That is a terrifying thought, and it brings up another fascinating, almost humorous image from the text, the concept of aging like an ox.
Yes, the ox. It says, a man who has learnt little grows old like an ox. His flesh grows, but his knowledge does not grow.
We all know people who are aging like oxen.
Oh, for sure. They accumulate chronological years, they accumulate status, maybe they get a larger house, a more impressive job title, their flesh grows, metaphorically speaking.
But internally, nothing.
Right. They haven't actually learned a single thing about themselves since they were 22. Their emotional intelligence is totally stunted.
Their ability to handle conflict is still juvenile.
They are just older, not wiser.
So, as a listener navigating this, I think the immediate practical question you have to ask yourself is, are you aging like an ox?
That's a great question to reflect on.
Look at the last 5 or 10 years of your life. Your resume has probably grown, your bank account might have grown, but has your actual self-knowledge deepened? Are you actively accumulating the internal treasure that will sustain you when the physical lake dries up?
Answering that honestly is tough, because it requires us to face the ultimate conclusion of this entire philosophical system.
Right. Because if the external world is chaotic, if performative purity is fake, and if our physical bodies are slowly breaking down, what is actually left?
What's left is the self.
Mm.
And that is where the text lands its absolute heaviest blow. It states famously, self is the Lord of self. Who else could be the Lord?
Self is the Lord of self. That is the terrifying freedom of radical independence.
It means that at the end of the day, you are entirely on your own. There is no external savior coming to rescue you.
You cannot outsource your psychological growth. Not to a life coach, not to a romantic partner, a political movement, or a deity.
You are the ultimate authority over your own mind, which means you hold the inescapable burden of total responsibility.
And because we intuitively know how heavy that burden is, we do everything in our power to avoid it.
We run from it constantly. The text points this out, saying, bad deeds and deeds hurtful to ourselves are easy to do. What is beneficial and good, that is very difficult to do.
It's difficult because it requires confronting our own hypocrisy.
And because confronting our own internal chaos is so painful, we develop this massive psychological defense mechanism. We project it outward.
We try to fix everybody else instead.
We live in an era of unprecedented external projection. Think about it. People spend hours online performing outrage, policing the behavior of absolute strangers, and aggressively trying to micromanage the lives of their family members.
The text gives a very strict operational directive to combat this. It says, let each man direct himself first to what is proper, then let him teach others. Thus a wise man will not suffer.
You have to fix your own house first.
If you don't, you generate what the author calls self-begotten evil. And I love the analogy used here. It says, this self-bred evil brings a person down as a creeper does with the tree which it surrounds.
A creeper vine. It's the perfect metaphor for self-sabotage.
Explain how the creeper vine works.
Well, it isn't a lumberjack coming into the forest with an axe to chop you down from the outside, right?
Or it's not an external attack.
The vine grows from the exact same soil you do. It's yours. And it slowly, almost imperceptibly, wraps around your trunk. It chokes off your sunlight, strangles your branches, and eventually the tree collapses entirely under the weight of a parasite it allowed to grow.
It destroys itself from the ground up. Because the problem is generated entirely by the self, the solution can only be generated by the self.
The text makes this crystal clear. By oneself, the evil is done. By oneself, one suffers. By oneself, evil is left undone. By oneself, one is purified. Purity and impurity belong to oneself. No one can purify another.
No one can purify another. That is a definitive rejection of the savior complex.
Absolutely definitive.
But, and I want to introduce a major point of friction here, because I think a lot of people will struggle with this. The very last verse we are looking at says something that feels wildly contradictory.
Okay, what does it say?
It says, let no one forget his own duty for the sake of another's, however great. Let a man, after he has discerned his own duty, be always attentive to his duty. Wait a minute. Earlier, we talked about the empathy principle, right? Recognizing our shared vulnerability and not harming others because they feel pain like we do.
Yes, the foundational rule of nonviolence.
Now, the text seems to be saying, ignore everyone else's problems and just focus entirely on yourself. Isn't that just a philosophical justification for being completely selfish?
It absolutely sounds like a contradiction on the surface. I get why you'd see it that way. But it is actually the ultimate expression of healthy psychological boundaries.
Okay, explain that. How is it not just selfishness?
We have to look at how the savior complex actually functions in the real world. Think about heavily codependent relationships. Think about the person who is endlessly exhausting themselves trying to keep a toxic family member sober.
Or trying to force a deeply unmotivated partner to suddenly be ambitious?
Right. They're constantly jumping into the quicksand to save them.
And what happens in the quicksand?
You cannot pull someone out of quicksand if you do not have stable footing yourself. If you jump in, you both just drown faster.
That makes sense.
Self is the Lord of self. It means accepting the profound, often heartbreaking reality that you simply cannot do someone else's inner work for them. That is their duty.
So it's about staying out of their quicksand.
Exactly. And when we obsessively focus on purifying another person, we almost always use it as a noble-sounding excuse to avoid doing our own inner work.
Ah, that is a gut punch. We use our helping as a distraction from our own mess. I am too busy managing my partner's chaotic life to look at the fact that my own career is stagnating and my own mental health is in the gutter. I am literally forgetting my own duty for the sake of another's.
Precisely. And this is where we see incredibly strong parallels with Stoic philosophy in the West. Think of Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius.
The dichotomy of control.
Yes. The absolute bedrock of Stoicism is the division between what is outside our control and what is squarely inside our control. Other people's actions, their purity, and their opinions are fundamentally outside our control.
Our own internal duty, our own choices are in our control.
And this ancient Indian text is arriving at the exact same psychological architecture. True freedom comes from radically accepting what is yours to carry and actively putting down the burdens that belong to someone else.
That totally reframes the entire concept. It isn't selfishness at all. It's structural integrity.
Which gives us a very clear, practical takeaway for the week ahead.
Yeah. A practice for the listener. The next time you feel that overwhelming, burning urge to correct someone else's behavior, or you feel yourself getting dragged into the vortex of another person's drama, I want you to hit pause.
Just stop and breathe.
Ask yourself, am I using their duty as a distraction to avoid dealing with my own? Are you trying to organize their messy room because you are absolutely terrified of opening the closet in yours?
That's the real question.
Let them fashion their own wood. You get back to carving yours.
It forces the energy back to the only place where you actually have any leverage.
Yeah.
Your own mind.
We have covered immense psychological territory today. I mean, we started with the slow, inescapable physics of karma.
The realization that the water pot fills drop by drop.
Right, and that we have to expand our time horizon to understand the consequences of our actions. We saw that you cannot outrun your own mind no matter what zip code you move to, and that the external poison of the world only infects you if you have an open wound of insecurity to receive it.
And from there, we explored the boomerang of harm. We learned that the universe doesn't punish us with magical lightning bolts, but that cruelty naturally and structurally unravels our lives through paranoia, chronic stress, and isolation.
We recognize that true nonviolence is born from acknowledging our shared vulnerability, that everyone trembles at pain. And we learned the power of being the shattered gong.
Grounding the electrical current of anger rather than just passing it along to the next person.
Then we confronted the very uncomfortable reality of physical decay. We looked at the dressed-up lump, not to promote self-loathing, but to cure our anxiety and our vanity.
We recognize the absolute danger of aging like an ox, accumulating status without actually gaining any wisdom.
And arriving at the end of our lives like old herons in a fishless lake.
And ultimately, we arrived at the stark reality of radical independence. No one can purify us, and we cannot purify anyone else. We are the sole architects and the sole demolishers of our own internal house.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to carry forward this week. In the chapter on old age, nestled among all those jarring descriptions of bones and decay, the author suddenly shifts to this triumphant architectural metaphor.
It's a massive shift in tone.
He says, "Looking for the maker of this tabernacle, I shall have to run through a course of many births. But now, maker of the tabernacle, thou hast been seen. Thou shalt not make up this tabernacle again. All thy rafters are broken, thy ridgepole is sundered."
In ancient construction, the ridgepole is the massive horizontal beam at the very peak of a roof. It is the single load-bearing element that holds the entire structure of the house together.
It's the linchpin.
Right. And in this psychological context, the maker of the tabernacle is our own blind craving, our endless desires, our attachments, and our ego that just keep building these fragile houses of suffering over and over.
So here is the final provocative thought for you to mull over. Look at the structures of anxiety, ambition, or resentment you have built your life around. You have spent years hammering the rafters, building a fortress to protect your ego, defending your opinions, and curating your image.
What is the single ridgepole? The core desire, the deep insecurity, or the desperate need for control that is holding up your greatest source of suffering right now.
And what would happen if you simply decided to look at it, recognize it, and snap it?
The roof would cave in, the fortress would finally collapse, and for the first time, you would actually see the open sky.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.